Welcome to the Americas 360 podcast. Get the inside scoop and the outside perspective on the latest developments from Canada, Latin America, and everywhere in between. Americas 360 is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars.
Welcome back to another episode of Americas 360. Hello, I'm John Molesky. This program is brought to you by the world's #1 think tank for regional studies. And Americas 360 is a collaboration among the Wilson Center's Argentina Project, Brazil Institute, Canada Institute, Latin American Program, and Mexico Institute. Last month, China's President Xi visited Moscow for a meeting with Vladimir Putin. At about the same time, President Biden was in Ottawa for a meeting with Prime Minister Trudeau. The Russia visit was just another indication of China's growing role as a global player, and Xi's focus is not limited to Moscow. In fact, the meeting between world leaders comes at a time when China's diplomatic relations with Latin American countries are developing at a rapid rate. How large a role can China play in the region? Will its diplomatic overtures to win over the Western Hemisphere's global South be successful? And what does it mean for North American influence and relationships in Latin America? Here to discuss these questions and more is our stellar team of analysts. Welcome back to the program, Wilson Center Distinguished Fellow Cindy Arnson.
Hi, John.
Latin American Program Director Benjamin Gaden.
Greetings, John.
Canada Institute Director Christopher Sands.
Hello, bonjour, John.
Brazil Institute Director Bruna Santos.
Hello, John.
And Mexico Institute Deputy Director Leila Ahmed.
Happy to be here.
Great to have all of you back with us. Let's begin looking at the big picture of China's growing influence. Just looking at some numbers from the Foreign Affairs Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives. While the U.S. is still Latin America's largest trading partner, when you divide Latin America, or where you reduce Latin America to just South America, China is the #1 trading partner. And here's a stunning figure that since 2000 to 2020, a 20-year period, China and Latin America, their trade has grown 26-fold, from 12 billion to 315 billion, and that's expected to double by 2035. So in the opening script, I talked about, is China, will they win over the global South? It sounds as if they're well on their way to doing so. Maybe if we go in the order of introduction and just get some quick thoughts from each of you on the rise of China in the Western Hemisphere and how you see the big picture developing. Cindy, could we begin with you, please?
Sure, John. China is a source of enormous development financing and infrastructure financing in Latin America. At its height, it was about $34.5 billion in 1 year alone in 2010. And that figure for many years was more than the combined total of the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Latin American Development Bank known as CAF combined. So it has enormous capital to invest in Latin America. And as the figures you indicated, I mean, the trade has just exploded with China's dynamic growth going, my figures, I think, are a little bit different than those of the House Committee, going from about 10 billion in the year 2000 to the record of 450 billion in 2021. And it's important to emphasize that the trade is predominantly in a handful of primary commodities, things like iron ore and copper from Chile and Peru, and soy from Brazil and Argentina, and oil as well from Ecuador and from Venezuela. But it is an enormous economic presence, and its economic weight is, I think, simply unmatched in the Western Hemisphere.
Benjamin Gaden.
All that is true, but actually a lot of that is changing. I mean, so China faces economic headwinds and its slowest growth in recent memory. That will diminish its demand for lots of the commodities exported by South America. And it also has diminished its appetite to invest in giant infrastructure projects that have given China a lot of leverage in developing countries in Africa and also in Latin America. So I think we're actually at an interesting moment where the trajectory of China is really changing in places like Latin America. Now, that doesn't mean that its market won't be very attractive, particularly, again, to countries like Brazil and Argentina and Chile that export commodities. And it doesn't mean that it won't continue as it is in Peru right now, buying up critical infrastructure, including energy production and transmission. But it does mean that the pace and scale of Chinese engagement is changing, and that has some real geopolitical consequences.
Thanks. Chris Sands.
Canada was a beneficiary as much of Latin America was selling commodities in China. And there was a period of time where China was the largest U.S. trading partner, outpacing both Canada and Mexico. And we gradually saw that shift back to where things were before. The U.S. as Canada, as the United States' largest trading partner, Mexico in second place, and China in third. And I think that very much reflects what Benjamin was talking about, where commodity-driven cycles really saw China's position both rise and fall. China was Canada's second largest trading partner for quite a while, but because of the disagreements between China and Canada over Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, who had been arrested on a U.S. warrant by the Canadians, and the two Michaels, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, who were taken hostage by the Chinese in retaliation, there were a series of Chinese trade actions banning Canadian canola, banning Canadian wheat, and even Canadian softwood lumber that really reduced Canada's reliance on China as an export market, not voluntarily, but just because. And now that the Michaels are home and Meng Wanzhou has been returned to China, there's still so much ill will that I think Canadians are looking as much as possible to decouple from China and to use that almost as a badge of honor to re-engage with the United States.
Bruna Santos.
Well, clearly, Beijing is pushing for geopolitical ties as well through infrastructure and ports and energy in Brazil. It's clear. But even though both countries are member of the BRICS and the G20, Brazil is still the only Latin American country in that group that has still not joined the China's Belt and Road Initiative. But Lula's foreign ministries has made it very clear that there's no reason for Brazil not to participate in that group. And as you know, the U.S. is Brazil's biggest investor, but China is its biggest trading partner. And of course, both are equally important for Brazil's technological development. And but Brazil can have an important role for Chinese investments, and that's what we've been seeing across the past years. Since 2017, it has increased like more than 200% the amount of of Chinese companies investing in the country, especially in the electricity sector. But it's also increasing in the technological sector. So just like if you look at, for example, China 3-ports presence in the country, it accounts for a big portion of the whole investment being made in solar panels in the country.
Great, thanks, Bruna. Leila Abed.
Yeah, so I think ever since Washington and Beijing were kind of locked in a fierce trade war, and with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and the opportunities really that nearshoring has presented, we know that companies around the world have moved their production centers closer to where their consumers are, and to avoid really shipping issues and geopolitical strains. And this scenario in many ways has benefited Mexico, given its geographical sort of proximity to one of the world's largest consumer markets, which is the United States. And therefore, in the last several years, many major Chinese companies have heavily invested in Mexico to tap into what is known as the North American trading bloc and really exploit its benefits. So with the new USMCA in place, Chinese firms are establishing factories that allow them now to label their goods as made in Mexico, which were previously labeled as made in China, but are now able to ship them from Mexico and ship finished products into the United States almost duty-free. So to give you some data from Mexico's government, between January and September of 2022, China was the country with the highest investment in company relocation projects in Mexico, representing 40%. And a study from the Bank of Mexico found that two of the main reasons why companies reallocate to Mexico are trade tensions between the United States and China, as well as compliance with the rules of origin under the USMCA. So nearshoring most definitely has played a key role in kind of the growing presence of China in Mexico, but it's not really the only reason why China has invested in Mexico. It also has financed key infrastructure projects of the AMLO administration. In 2020, the Chinese Development Bank announced it would invest $600 million for the construction of the Dos Bocas oil refinery, which is in the home state of the Mexican president, Tabasco. And in 2020, the same year, a Mexican consortium announced that in partnership with the China Communications Construction Company, they would build AMLO's infamous Mayan train, which is a staple, right, of his fourth transformation government. And also in the telecommunications sector, China's Huawei, which landed a contract in 2017 to provide sort of equipment for Mexico's communication network, has raised real concerns of what this means to have Chinese telecommunications equipment very close to the border, and has raised sort of national security and cybersecurity issues in the United States. And so despite the efforts by past Mexican administrations to sort of strengthen economic ties with China, the U.S. still remains Mexico's top trading partner and foreign investor. But I do see that Chinese companies will continue to invest in strategic sectors, including energy and telecommunications, like has been mentioned here by my colleagues. And it's definitely something that, could kind of shift the relationship between the United States and Mexico economically, which is so important, and with Canada sort of as a key partner of the USMCA. And I think in economic terms, this can signify something really important for the future of China's presence in Mexico. And hopefully I'll have the opportunity to talk about sort of the rise of fentanyl and the precursors coming from China into Mexico, because that's sort of the security component to China's presence in Mexico and what that means for the United States.
Okay, great. Thanks, Leila. Chris?
Well, I was just going to jump in on Leila's comment, because I think one of the interesting things we're starting to see is Canada and Mexico in some competition to show that they are closer to the U.S. and farther from China. And Canada has been taking a series of steps, disallowing Chinese investment in lithium mining companies, moving away from certain Chinese investments and trying to use their national security rules to block them, while at the same time embracing U.S. policy on a range of issues, including their Indo-Pacific strategy with a more forward military presence in the Indo-Pacific, organized around Japan and South Korea. And all of this, what they're trying to say is we don't see a future as China's ally. We're going to be more the American ally than ever. And I think in that, they're hoping that they get a better return from investors in the United States who feel at least Canada's on side and will be safe. But it will be a competition with Mexico, and the Canadians are bringing it.
About this cooperation versus competition question, in the United States, the debate around China has been largely negative in recent years, and even the term new Cold War has been employed. I'm wondering what you could tell us about how countries of Latin America feel about, and we know Canada has had its conflicts or its tensions as well. But I wonder, can we make any comments across the region, maybe specific countries that have any reticence about dealing with China? Or is it the opposite? Are they ready to fully embrace China and welcome all of its investment, and assuming that what comes with that is growing influence?
There's absolutely no appetite almost anywhere in Latin America for turning down Chinese investment and trade. It's a non-starter in almost every capital in the region. And frankly, it makes the United States sound silly to even raise the possibility. The kind of posture you just heard described by Chris in Canada is simply not something you'll hear in Latin America. Bruna can talk about the view from Brasilia. But the Latin Americans, I think, are firmly in the camp of gaining whatever benefits they can from anyone who wants to invest and trade throughout the Americas. The economies in the region haven't grown in a decade, and the infrastructure is very poor. And I think even though it is true that there's a real values mismatch between authoritarian China and democratic countries in the Americas, there's just an unwillingness and maybe an inability, given fragile economic conditions, to turn down opportunities to trade with China and to accept Chinese investment in infrastructure.
Cindy Arntzen.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think no Latin American country wants to be forced to take sides in this growing tension between the United States and China. And what's interesting is that the countries that have these close ties with China are by no means all countries of the left. There are two center-right, centrist countries right now in Ecuador and Uruguay, one who has signed a free trade agreement with China, one who is seeking it. And both of those countries actually have been turned down by the United States in their efforts to negotiate a free or to even discuss a free trade agreement because they're left out of this multiplicity of free trade agreements that the United States has in the region. So I think it goes across the ideological spectrum that people see benefit to their own economies at a time of very difficult economic straits, as we've discussed in previous episodes.
Money talks, right? Leila, let's go to you. And then Bruna, I know you want to say something, but I have a question for you as well. But Leila, you go ahead now, please.
And I couldn't agree more with what Benjamin and Cindy have said about Latin American countries, but I think Mexico has to be very careful, right? Because of its close relationship to the United States and Canada and the USMCA. And there's a key contribution of the USMCA, which is Article 32.1, which basically discourages any party from signing false free trade agreements with countries that do not allow open competition or full property rights and therefore cannot trade freely. I mean, this is obviously inserted into the USMCA text, and it's aimed at China, right? Aimed at discouraging trade with China, especially Mexico and the key parties of the USMCA. And so I think that even though we see a lot of Chinese investment in Mexico in key areas, I think it's going to have to be way more careful than its Latin American counterparts and on its approach on China and how it allows Chinese investment to flow into its country.
Bruna, we had some breaking news as we prepared for this recording, and that President Lula, because of a case of pneumonia, has to postpone his trip to China. But we know that it will be rescheduled eventually, and I wanted to get your thoughts on what expectations are for that trip.
Yeah, the trip that was just recently canceled was going to be a big trip. I mean, he was traveling with a delegation of 240 people among ministers, cabinet members, business owners. And by the way, Lila, visit to Huawei was set. And I think that this trip happening after Lula's visit to the U.S., I think is a sign of Brazil's willingness to assert its independence. It's like Lula going back to Brazil's foreign policy tradition of non-alignment, no automatic alliances with the West or China. And of course, there were like ideas of discussions around trade, around the possibility or not for Brazil to join the Belt and Road Initiative, but also expectations about whether or not Lula would bring up the possibility of like playing a role or demonstrating some power to mediate a conflict in Ukraine and the role of China and all that, which is also sounds kind of naive coming from Brazil, which is a country that has is not seen or perceived as an impartial mediator in this because it's part of the BRICS. But just I think that in that perspective and with the message that Lula sent, and exactly like I agree 100% with Benjamin on that, like we can't afford to take sides on this. So I think Brazil seems to prioritize like more flexible partnerships now rather than rigid alliances in order to adapt to this world that is totally different than the first and second terms of Lula. And this may involve actually collaborating also with countries in the global north. So I'm confident that Brazil might prioritize finalizing the free trade agreement with the European Union, for example, and or to join the OECD, but also keeping partnerships with the global south, exploring the possibility of a free trade agreement between Mercosur and China. So I think that more flexible approach to those alliances is what I foresee for Brazil's foreign policy in the coming years.
Thanks. It's always difficult when from the host chair to look at the clock, part of my job, and we are just about out of time. And we've only begun to scratch the surface. I think we could all probably agree that we're going to revisit this topic sooner rather than later and dive a little deeper into some of these specifics. But before we close today, I want to ask for a final thought from each of you. You know, as you look ahead in this question of China's growing influence in the hemisphere, is there a particular circumstance or date or project or something that you'll be looking at that could be telling about how these trend lines will continue? Because, you know, one of the underlying, the white noise underneath this discussion is, does this change U.S. strategy, Canadian strategy, Mexican strategy, North American strategy as they look south because of China's rapid growth? And so if you could each take maybe about 10 seconds for a quick thoughts. I hate to do that to you. And let's just to mix things up, we'll do it in reverse order of introduction, which puts you in the leadoff position, Leela.
Yeah, thank you, John. I think something that, Mexico is going to be looking at very closely is something that I mentioned at the beginning, and that is fentanyl and the precursors coming in from China. The seizures that CBP has registered over the last 2 years have, completely increased. It is something that is costing American lives, and it's definitely a priority for the White House. It's a priority for Mexico, and it's a huge aspect of the security cooperation agenda between the two countries.
Great, thank you, Bruna.
One topic of concern, I think, is energy, and of course, the investments that China's been doing in Brazil in technology and sectors that are important for technological progress, such as critical minerals and the whole industry of semiconductors. So that's one of the things that I would follow up closely as we move forward.
Great. Thank you. Christopher.
Well, I think it's going to be interesting for Canada. We just saw in the lead up to President Biden's visit to Ottawa, charges that a member of Parliament had actually discouraged the release of the two Michaels to the Consul General of China in Toronto. Something that shocked everyone, forced this member of Parliament who is ethnically Chinese to step back from his seat and sit as an independent and try to clear his name. It has been a shock to Canada just how much China has infiltrated Canadian politics and tried to interfere with their democracy. So if anything, I see the Canadians becoming much more hardline. Remember that 5% of Canada's population, which is just about 40 million now, is of Chinese ethnic origin. So Canada will not ignore China, but they seem to be moving much more closely into alignment with the U.S.
Yeah, Benjamin.
One thing that I'll be watching is whether we can identify the right metrics for measuring this competition in the Western Hemisphere. I think often we just use the wrong measurements of how we're competing with China. Whether countries recognize Taiwan, whether they're members of China's Belt and Road Initiative, whether they buy infrastructure from Huawei for telecommunications, and not recognizing that this is a long struggle. And that what really matters is the United States presence in investing in infrastructure, in investing in diplomatic relationships, in trading with the countries in this region. And, that's what I'll be keeping an eye on.
Thanks, Benjamin. Cindy, you get the final word.
Sure. I'll be watching, as Benjamin was hinting, the battle really between the United States and China over 5G infrastructure, and especially looking to see what U.S. companies are able to offer Latin American countries that are interested in 5G to compete with Huawei. I'll also be looking to see whether the growing momentum in South America and Central America towards creating marine protected areas will bump up against the Chinese illegal fishing and the parking of these huge fishing fleets just outside the protected areas and the territorial waters of numerous Latin American countries, and how that issue plays out, and whether countries in creating these marine protected areas can actually enforce those territorial waters.
Great. Thanks, Cindy. Thanks to all of you. As always, we learn a lot from you and really appreciate it. This is the part of the program where I read this paragraph that says this episode of America's 360 was produced by Oscar Cruz, Zoe Reed, with the assistance of Aldrin Ballesteros, Emma Brown, Sarah Doshi, and Patrizia Trocoli. But I want to go off the script here, pull back the curtain, and Zoe, turn on your microphone. Zoe Reed, one of those people I thanked. This is her final episode of America's 360, and she has been one of the stalwarts behind this program. Zoe, are you there? I was going to read this very sentimental paragraph that I wrote about you and tell you how much we appreciate you and how we'll miss you. But, I thought, what the hell? Let's just turn on the microphone. You're always behind the scenes making us look good, certainly making me look way smarter than I am. So your thoughts? We hate to see you go, but I know you're moving on to a terrific opportunity.
Thank you very much, John. And I've loved working on America's 360. I'd just like to thank all of you. I think in every topic that we choose, I learn why the podcast is called what it is. Everything impacts every country of the Americas, whether it comes to mind geographically or not. And I think you've all proved that again in this episode. So I'd like to thank you all for letting me work on this project.
No, thank you. Sincerely, I know I speak for all of us when I say that. And congratulations, and we'll be watching. We know they're a great success in your future. But as we say in the business, the show will go on, and we'll be back in a couple weeks, minus Zoe, and while we're still missing Zoe, with another episode of America's 360. So until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thank you for joining us.
You have been listening to America's 360, a podcast about the innumerable ties among the nations of the Western Hemisphere. You can subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. To learn more about our programs, please visit wilsoncenter.org. And please join us again next time for another episode of America's 360.